Um, it's the experience of many Christian students who attend university that they find their faith troubled and they begin to have doubts.
Sure.
What advice would you give to someone who is experiencing serious doubts?
Well, there's a number of things I think that I would say about that. First of all, I think that I would tell them that they need to understand the proper relationship between faith and reason. And my view here is that the way in which I know Christianity is true is first and foremost on the basis of the witness of the Holy Spirit in my heart. And that this gives me a self-authenticating means of knowing that Christianity is true wholly apart from the evidence. And therefore, if in some historically contingent circumstances the evidence that I have available to me should turn against Christianity, I don't think that that controverts the witness of the Holy Spirit. In such a situation, I should regard that as simply a result of the contingent circumstances that I'm in, and that if I were to pursue this with due diligence and with time, I would discover that in fact the evidence, if I could get the correct picture, would support exactly what the witness of the Holy Spirit tells me. So I think that's very important to get the relationship between faith and reason right. Otherwise, what that means is that our faith is dependent upon the shifting sands of evidence and argument, which change from person to person, place to place, and generation to generation. Whereas the Holy Spirit and His testimony gives every generation and every person immediate access to a knowledge of God and the truth of Christianity that's independent of the shifting sands of time and place and person and historical contingency. First, we want to consider objections to the form of the argument. So, objection number one. Craig says that he believes in God on the basis of the self-authenticating witness of the Holy Spirit in his heart, not on the basis of the Kalam Cosmological Argument. In fact, he says that even if the argument were refuted, he would still believe in God. This is blatant hypocrisy on Craig's part. Response to objection number one. The problem with this objection is that even if I were a hypocrite, there's just no relationship between the soundness of an argument and the psychological state of the person propounding it. The objector is thus guilty of putting forth a textbook example of an argument ad hominem. That is to say, trying to invalidate a position by attacking the character of the person who defends it. So what does make for a sound deductive argument? The answer is true premises and valid logic. True premises and valid logic. An argument is sound if the premises of the argument are true and the conclusion follows from the premises by the rules of logic. The soundness of the Kalam Cosmological Argument is thus entirely independent of me. The argument was, after all, defended by the medieval Muslim theologian Al-Ghazali 1,000 years before I was born. If the argument is sound, it was sound then. If the argument is sound, it was sound during the Jurassic period, before anyone had propounded it. My alleged hypocrisy just has nothing to do with the soundness of the argument. Now, to be a good argument, the argument must admittedly be more than merely sound. If the premises of an argument are true, but we have no evidence for the truth of those premises, then the argument will not be a good one. It may, unbeknownst to us, be sound, but in the absence of any evidence for the premises, it won't, or at least shouldn't, convince anyone. The premises have to have some kind of epistemic warrant for us in order for a sound argument to be a good argument. Now, I've argued that what is needed is that the premises need to be not only true, but more plausible than their opposites or negations. If it is more plausible that a premise is true in light of the evidence rather than false, then we ought to believe the premise. Now, plausibility is, to a certain degree, person relative. Some people may find a premise more plausible than its opposite, while others may not. In that sense, the goodness of an argument is not wholly independent of people's psychological states. In the case of the Kalam Cosmological Argument, I do, in fact, find the premises more plausible than their opposites, and therefore I'm convinced that it is a good argument. I just don't regard the argument as the basis for my belief in God. And I've been quite candid about that. My belief in God is a properly basic belief grounded in the inner witness of God's Holy Spirit. And I find it odd that rather than being commended for my candor, I'm accused of hypocrisy. I've elsewhere defended the proper basicality of belief in God on the basis of the Spirit's witness, but that's quite unnecessary here, for even if I were entirely mistaken about that, it would have no bearing on the worth of the Kalam Cosmological Argument. To illustrate the point, suppose I believe that Abraham Lincoln was one of the greatest of the American presidents. And in order to convince you of this, I present to you the testimony of expert historians, along with a detailed account of Lincoln's amazing accomplishments. But suppose that the real reason that I think Lincoln was so great is because he had a beard. And I once had a beard and therefore am prejudiced in favor of bearded presidents. Obviously, my personal prejudice would have no bearing whatsoever upon the worth of the evidence for Lincoln's greatness. Similarly, whatever reason I have personally for believing in God, whether it's the witness of the Holy Spirit or the ontological argument or the teleological argument or divine revelation or whatever, that just has no relation to the soundness or the worth of the Kalam Cosmological Argument. The skeptic may not like my taking belief in God as properly basic, but that's not a criticism of the Kalam Cosmological Argument. That's at best a rejection of proper basicality of belief in God, which has simply no bearing on the worth of the Kalam argument.